All right, it's no secret that youth athletes are training harder than ever, but are they actually training smarter? Athletes, are you training for quantity or the quality of your work? Today's guest, performance coach Sal Marinello, has 35 plus years of experience developing high performing athletes at all levels of their sport. And today he's going to be breaking down the biggest mistakes youth athletes and their coaches are making and what quality training should actually look like. So, Sal, thanks for joining us.
Nick, great to be here. Thanks for having me, and I appreciate it. Love talking to you.
Of course. And I know, like, Sal's got his own podcast. He's got a lot of things he unpacks there. So we're gonna kind of take it at that angle, but I really want to pull out the things that Sal, you see are the biggest issues. So you work mostly with baseball players, but this I'm sure can apply to a lot of other athletes and sports. But what are the biggest mistakes you see youth athletes making in their training and development?
Well, I think that you could let me talk for about 2 hours, Nick, just with that lead in question, but
Yeah.
I'll try to take it in an order and make it palatable. I think the biggest problem is the weight room, and that is what people say to the typical parent of a 14-year-old. Let's use baseball. I do a lot of lacrosse too. I think most sports should train like baseball and lacrosse. Lacrosse especially because it incorporates a lot of the three-dimensional training, the three-dimensional movement you get in other sports with the component of high intensity movement. Whereas baseball, again, the batting swing is high intensity. Add that to what we do in lacrosse, which you've got an athlete running in almost any direction and still needing to have that rotational ability. So the weight room is the biggest problem, Nick, because this started back in my day in the 70s when the weight room you either were in the weight room or you weren't, and you would be better in the weight room than if you weren't. Also, because we weren't playing sports all year round or one sport at the exclusion of every other sport. All the guys I knew that were the best baseball players, I was a pretty good baseball player. If you brought your glove into school during November, December, January, or were looking for some place to hit, people would have thought you were crazy. And those guys many of them went on to play college and some in low professional level baseball. So we have a bunch of different things, Nick. We now have this all around year training with the weight room as it was designed 50 plus years ago and is still being done that way now, with the advent of guys and girls playing sports all year round, some of at the I'm not sure what's worse, Nick, playing baseball all year round at the exclusion of other sports or soccer or lacrosse, or playing those sports in conjunction, stacking those sports on others. So we have that is probably your number one position. And being that you talked about training, the weight room as it's currently presented is the biggest problem.
Oof. Okay. So we're definitely going to unpack those. So I do want to highlight on the specialization, and I like that you comment on the stacking of the sports because playing two seasons at the same time basically because I hear it from physical therapists all the time of all these kids that are getting injured because they're playing for their soccer high school team, but then they're also going and playing for their travel team on the weekends and or the club team, and the just stacking that wears that body out and prevents real development.
Agree.
On the weight room side, can you unpack that a little more of like what you feel like is really what's going wrong in the weight room?
So if you go back again, let's take it back 50, say to the 70s when it started to be, that was in my era, when it started to become something that you either did or did not do. It was based still at that point on some sound principles. For as much what I call meathead stuff we used to do, bench press, leg press, it for the most part was compound. I'm going to use a little bit. I don't use a lot of technical stuff, but here's a little bit. Ground-based compound movement. That means your feet are on the ground and your body is working pretty much together to produce movement, with the exception of the bench press. The bench press was the early days of training, and that kind of took over. That was the most important thing. However, being that we did other things, we had in my town here in Millburn, where I still have my business, we had a very good phys ed program. So we were doing gymnastics, we were doing wrestling, we were doing calisthenics, one of the highest level accolades you could get. Not only was what at the time was the Presidential Physical Fitness Award program, we had what was called the gold shorts that were above and beyond that, that incorporated push-ups, pull-ups, body weight squat, a 600-meter run or an 800-meter run. So there were other components to that that over that overshadowed that one narrow negative, which I would say is the bench press. So we played three sports. We played pickup sports. We would play basketball in the summer after baseball. So we were doing all of those things and developing. We had free play. I grew up playing tag and war and kill the man with the ball and dodgeball, where all kids played that. So you developed what I have stolen this phrase from a colleague. We had a very robust movement vocabulary because of all those things we did. So the weight room has now taken over, where the bench press and the squat and the deadlift, all positions that have nothing to do with any athletic endeavor whatsoever, except those weightlifting pursuits, has taken over. And you're putting kids in positions they're not moving or they're not in on the field, and grinding them and grinding them and grinding them and actually detraining them. One of my other colleagues has another great phrase. I have great colleagues. We're training the athleticism out of these kids by the things we're doing in the weight room.
Oof. That's a good one right there. I was like, I just gotta pause on that.
And it's not hyperbole, but I kind of do overstate some of these things to get people's attention, because you can't have a little bit of all of that stuff that's bad, because then I've just seen it. I've seen it. Doesn't matter if it's the youngest level of kid to the professional level of athlete. Those narrow focused lifts and movements start to take over. Here's an example. And if you couldn't tell from my name, I'm Italian. So it would be like if I went to my grandmother and said, Grandma, show me how you make your sauce. And she puts all these ingredients in, and they're great. And at the end, she takes her hairbrush and takes a clump of hair and puts it into the sauce. And I said, Grandma, what the heck are you doing? You're putting your hair in there. It's like, oh, but I've always done it. It tastes good, doesn't it? But yeah, you've ruined it for me, because I know that's in there and it's no good. And over time, it's going to have a negative effect. That's the same thing with the deadlift and the bench press and the heavy back squat. That's the hair in the tomato sauce that ruins the whole recipe.
Dang. Okay. I just gotta process that a little bit. That's really good. So I definitely want to, we're gonna come back to this, because I definitely want to unpack what we should be doing. So getting more into that, but I wanna continue deconstructing what athletes think they should be doing. So let's go to that number 2 thing that you mentioned, which was the playing one sport year round. Baseball being a common one. Football, I see it a lot. It's becoming more and more with basketball, with AAU and everything. So what are the flaws you see in that? And yeah, we'll start there.
So one of the things I've seen over the last 20 plus years is kids no longer know how to run properly. One of the first things I do when I get athletes is I video them and their sprint form, and I have them do some drills that to me reveal how they run. And there is a sprint movement mechanics expert in the field I recommend, if you're in the field, to look him up. His name is Franz Bosch. Franz with an S, Bosch, Bosch. He is a Belgian man who is a baseball and track and field movement expert, but he specializes in the sprint. And he has a phrase, there's many ways to dance, there's only one way to waltz. And there's many ways, he compares that to the sprint. You sprint and everything else follows from that. So if your sprint form suffers, your agility suffers. So I'm not a big agility ladder fan, but you could take any agility drill, and if you're working on agility at the exclusion of sprinting, your ceiling is going to be lower than it would if you trained your athletes like sprinters. So let's get back to your question about the athletes that play certain sports. Basketball players run terribly. Soccer players, believe it or not, at the youth level, do not know how to run, because everything they've done is usually based around the soccer ball. I've worked with some very high level soccer sport clubs that when you watch these kids with the ball, they're amazing. You take the ball away and they don't know how to run. So what that's doing is it's setting a lower ceiling than that athlete could have because you're not teaching them how to run. Now, I think, again, I'm a football fan. I'm a football coach also. I've trained a lot of football players. There's a lot of negatives about football. However, I think there's many positives. The positives are a lot of their training represents what they need to be able to do on the field. And I think because football, except for some rare occasions, you're not taking kids and having them play football all year round. So the training is a little closer aligned to actual endeavor that they're involved in. And a lot of the higher level guys have track. That's one of the things I want to get to. Track and field as a sport has disappeared in a lot of places. I had a strong track background just because of my school system, where our phys ed teachers incorporated track into what we did. And Nick, a lot of what I do with these athletes, whether it's a kid or a pro, is some of the same stuff I did when I was in seventh, eighth, and ninth grade, which was junior high school, not middle school, but that was junior high. That's what set the foundation. So you have the sports that don't feature sprinting. You have the training that doesn't really focus on sprinting. And then you have that at the exclusion of all other sports, especially if there's not an upper body coordination component to it, like soccer tends to be. I have soccer athletes, they just tend to be less coordinated overall with certain things. So you have this perfect storm of of circumstances that are working to make our kids less capable, less resilient also.
Dude, so much good stuff already. Wow. So, and it comes at a such a different perspective. Like I hear, this is a common conversation, is the specialization, but at the same time, the way that you're talking about it around, just the lack of ability to move properly is huge. And when you're doing, like you said, always around a soccer ball, always around a basketball, always around a certain ball or whatever it might be, it's like you don't learn how to move in other ways. And I mean, we have plenty of examples. Like last podcast, one of the athletes I was referenced was Mahomes. It was about baseball, but he talked about how Mahomes is a guy who played both football and baseball, and you see it in how he can leverage a lot of those throws.
Yeah, it's sports IQ. It's all these things on top of. I love the term the movement vocabulary, because that really sums it up. It's like, what can you do? How do you do it? Well, you give the body a problem and let it solve it. That's usually the best way. That's why free play is so important. Climb the rope, climb the jungle gym, go down the slide and be able to land on your feet and run because someone's chasing you. Those are all things that, if you look at sports, a lot of them replicate those same attributes. And that's the sprint. What the sprint is doing is it's training the body at the highest level, so your nervous system is firing. And Nick, that's what this is all about. It's, what is your nervous system trained to do? If you're grinding out deadlift and squat and bench press and overhead press and those single muscle group exercises that I see in Division I training programs of all sports, you're teaching your body to move as a collection of parts, and you're teaching your body to move slowly. There's no speed component in any of those lifts. And those are just training muscles, not training movements. That's what I always say. You train movements, not muscles. So why do we have these pulled muscles all the time? Why do we have groin, back, hip, all of these oblique problems in baseball? Because we're training slowly, and then in our competition, we're moving explosively. And again, I'll go back to the hair in the tomato sauce. More and more hair is being put into the tomato sauce, so it becomes an inedible or unedible, whichever. So that's where we're at. And that's where I kind of have taken the stand, and I tell people all the time, if you want to fix baseball, nobody gets in the weight room. You have to, if you're a strength coach and you want to defend your program, you have to then tell me why we're including it. I'm starting from a standpoint of, it's all gone, and we add things back in based on merit, not because we just always did it. Every baseball player has done the empty can and the rotator cuff moves, and every one of those guys have had Tommy John surgery. So they don't necessarily help. We have to look at all these things more critically. Why are we doing it? And are they helping, or are they hurting, or are they doing nothing? And at which point they should still be out.
Dude, I'm already thinking about us having, we need to have another podcast. All right. I'm already thinking about, I'm like, dude, I need to have you back because we're
Good.
constrained on time, but there's so many things we can unpack. I want to hit on the third piece, and you started to hit on this, is when we talk about in the weight room, when we talk about some of the training that's happening, there's a lot of tools, a lot of equipment that are being used that I know that you're not a fan of, but do you want to unpack that one a little bit?
Well, give me one. What are you
So
thinking?
you think with baseball, for example, there's a lot, and I see this with football with the weighted balls, but there's the weighted. I mean, there's weighted balls, but then there's also weighted baseballs, weighted baseball bats. There's probably going to be weighted mitts here soon. What's your take on
Yeah.
that kind of stuff?
Okay, so again, a little history. There is a Russian coach and scientist, Bondarchuk is his name. He was a throws coach. And now we'll all assume the Russians were using drugs when they were at the pinnacle. But that being said, they were meticulous about what they did. And Bondarchuk found that the closest correlation from training to performance was who could throw the implement closest to the competition weight the furthest. So shot, discus, javelin. It wasn't the guy who bench pressed the most, who squatted the most, who could snatch or clean and press the most. It was the guy who could throw the shot put slightly heavier and slightly lighter than the competition one, the furthest. That's what translated. So let's go to your weighted baseball. There is research that shows it works, but it tends to work in the short term, because at the end of the day, those athletes that have gone through that program and have had a rotator cuff or a Tommy John have done that training. So that training is partially responsible for it. So nobody knows the right, my opinion is nobody knows the right weight of the baseball to throw. Nobody knows the right weight of a weighted bat to throw. That is going to be an assistance, but is still, that is not going to be a detriment either to performance or as an injury risk. One of the guys I got to know in the early 2000s was involved in the Nebraska football strength program when they were the last run they had when they won the national championship. I think it was late 90s, early 2000s. And they found a lot of people were using these heavy med balls, and they were using very light med balls for these 250 plus pound athletes. They were using, 2, 3, 5 pound med balls because they recognized outside of a certain range that you're slowing someone down, and it might be imperceptible to the human eye. So you could take a kid short term and have him throw a heavy baseball a certain speed that's going to look great, and maybe in the short term his velocity increases. But at the end of the day, you're probably doing damage that is ultimately detrimental to his long-term health. And one more thing, Nick, I want to say, not to go off on a tangent, but all the greats threw in the upper 90s or mid 90s. They just didn't have to do it all the time. They didn't need a weighted baseball. Now, this is not I'm not some Luddite who doesn't want to have any technical movement forward. But at the end of the day, you look at the greats, they threw hard. And I know what we haven't talked about it, but the radar gun measures differently. So 99 today was 94, 93, or 92 yesterday. It's the same thing. It's because we're overloading these arms that they're breaking down. So I might have gone off the path there, but
No,
that
that's
that's
good.
that's about the weighted implement. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm not saying they're good. I'm saying they can be good, just like anything could be good. Some of the best things I think you could do, if you do them incorrectly or too much, they can become bad. I don't think we have enough true knowledge about what works as far as those implements go. And we certainly have enough data to show that they could be causing the problem.
Mm, dude. Yeah, and that's huge. And I like that you comment on the guns too, because it goes back to that early specialization. It goes back to overtraining, 2 seasons, all those things where you're wearing out those arms very quickly. Just
Yeah.
like with soccer players, they're wearing out their ankles, their ACLs, all those things way too quickly. So yeah, no, I think it's huge to highlight all of that for sure. And I
Well,
like that.
I think a problem, sorry to cut you up, but I think a problem with people that do what I do and maybe do it in the baseball space. If I have a kid that comes to me and they're like, I want to run a 4.4, at some point you have to be in touch with reality and you have to go through the steps. And then depending on how old the kid is, you could you could extrapolate based on training. And at some point you have to say, we're not going to get there. I've had that happen with some guys trying to get to the combine. You got to break a 4.6. Well, you know what? You're 23, you're running a 4.61. I don't know if we could get to that 4.5. It's kind of difficult. And then at what point are you just doing it to do it? Same thing. Just because a kid wants to throw or needs to throw 95, every kid's not going to be able to throw 95, even if they were a very good pitcher at a young age. You don't know that. Trying to do that is something that you will get hurt at in baseball that you won't get hurt at if you're trying to get faster. You might pull a muscle, you might wear down a little bit, you might overtrain if you're trying to do that kind of speed training, but you're not necessarily almost assuredly going to hurt yourself. Throwing too hard, you're assuredly going to hurt yourself.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, especially when you think about anatomy and all of that, like that makes a lot of sense. So let's flip to what athletes should actually be doing. And so I want to start off with how you approach a middle school athlete and how they should be focusing their training, whether it be any weight room whatsoever, whether it be, like you mentioned, calisthenics, like what should training look like for a middle school athlete?
A lot of coordination work. So jump rope, jumping jacks, I do a lot of calisthenics with coordination components to it, with footwork components to it. Back in the old days, you might call it a footwork drill. But I do a lot of things with coordination. And Nick, the reason you want to do that, the younger you are, the more sensitive you are to improving your coordination. And how coordinated you can become sets your ceiling for skill acquisition and development. So when you have these young kids that are training, even as young as 10, all the way through this age range you've mentioned, you have to have coordination because that's ultimately going to set the skill. So teach them how to sprint, body weight mechanics, body weight movement, jumping, how to jump properly. I don't love jumping up on a box. Ask me why.
Dude, why do you not like boxes?
Okay, so the most risk you're at is when you land, right? Very rarely do you get an ACL injury when someone jumps. It's when they land. The reason is more force is produced. So if you're always working on jumping up on the box and that box is high, we've all seen those social media videos where the box is at the guy's chest or girl's chest and they're jumping on it and landing in a deep squat with their full feet not even on the box and they're not landing on the ground. And then what happens when you go out and you jump and you're playing basketball or track and field or any other sport? You jump and then you're coming down and you're landing and you don't know how to negotiate and how to manage the stress that comes with that. And that's a reason I rarely do box jumps where you're just jumping up onto, because most people, you could accomplish the same thing with a vertical jump, but guess what? Or a broad jump, you have to land and you have to learn how to navigate and negotiate that. So the box jump works all on the accelerators, which most kids have, and none of the brakes, which most kids do not have. So I think a lot of that emphasis on the box jumps on the explosive phase is responsible for a lot of these other injuries we're seeing. But that, going back to the youth, how do you jump? How do you land? How do you jump sideways? Can you skip? Can you skip with different arm patterns? A lot of the running drills I use to improve sprint form, I use with my youngest athletes, as well as my professional guys. That body weight, pull-ups, push-ups, body weight squat, single leg squat, all the variations of those. I have a series of balance drills I do on one leg where you're picking up something and bending your knee to get to the ground and being able to manipulate. I take the tops of water bottles, and I use them as the implement they have to pick up and put down in different patterns. So those are the things I'm working on. How do you move explosively? How do you move in 360 degrees? And can you control your own body weight?
Hmm. Dude, and calling me out on the box jumps because I was just doing those the other day. um,
Yeah.
but Yeah, but I think it goes back to when we talk about velocity, when we talk about speed, everyone wants those numbers. So when I think about box jumps, I'm like, I can easily measure myself of how high I jumped versus if you're just vertical, depending on where you're at, you may not be able to measure it as easily. And so I think that's the appeal of it. But
Well,
I
it
also
looks
understand.
cool.
Yeah, yeah.
It looks cool, but
But I really like that you mentioned the deceleration, the coming down aspect of it, because that's the same idea with lifts. Like I've seen a number of guys in gyms where they can't even control the way down. They lift the heavy weight. You think about speed. We can. I just had a guy who specializes in speed on the podcast, and he talks about like, yes, acceleration, but you also got to learn how to decelerate. That's a key part of speed training. So it's like, yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense.
well, most young athletes that are good, the good athletes that are at risk when you're talking about these high school kids that are tearing their ACL, aside from the turf being a problem and the shoes being a problem, it's most of these athletes have great accelerators, no brakes, and that's a part of it. And the old saying we have is if you can't lower it, you can't lift it. So that's what you talked about dropping. I don't never understood that either, but again, I guess it's the box jump version of a lift.
Yeah, I makes a lot of sense for sure. I mean, in that sense, it doesn't make sense, but it does.
So wait, I want what? So the weight room for me now, when I started, if this was 100% of what I did, the weight room was probably this much. Now the weight room is probably this much because of the time I spend on movement, and then I get very deep into the some of the Olympic lifts. I hesitate to call them the Olympic lifts because they're really not. I have a series of what I call explosive coordination moves that I use with dumbbells that enhance a lot of the same attributes we're trying to develop for sport performance without trying to replicate the movements themselves. So that sounds like a complicated explanation. What I'll do if we do this again is I can send you some of the videos of some of the movements to get the basics, but that's what I spend a lot of time on. And really, Nick, if you think about it, if you look at the sports that the athletes are the best when they're youngest, sports like figure skating and gymnastics, those gymnasts are as explosive as anybody, and they're not really lifting weights. They're doing that all with body weight stuff, with coordination and with patterns that require a lot of the nervous system and will carry over to a lot of things, especially if you're playing those sports too. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm never trying to replicate, excuse me, the same movement in the gym that we do on the field. I'm trying to develop the qualities necessary to transition to those skills and those qualities.
So then, does your training look different than whether you're working with a baseball, football, soccer?
Not really. Because there it's if you're I use the term, my business is athletic development coaching. I use the term athletic development when I go into a school. Some of the places I work, I'm not the strength coach, I'm the athletic development coach. And a couple of guys I've coached with now, I'm coaching back in high school with a guy I coached with 25 years ago from high school through the Division 1 level of college. He refers to me as an athletic development coach. He knows that because we're changing the perception. When you think, and especially if you want girls and women in the field and in the weight room, it's not strength training or it's not a strength coach. We're building athletes, we're developing athletes. So I call it athletic development and athlete development, not strength training or a strength coach.
That's good. I like that. That's why I was careful about even when I introduced you, I was like, I heard specifically not a personal trainer, not strength coach. So I was like, okay, well, I didn't catch the athletic development part, but performance, I feel like is
Yeah,
it's close,
performance
but
is
not
good
quite.
too. Yeah, but like really when you that's with my older, more mature athletes, but when you're with young kids, you're really
Yeah.
developing that's a developing kid. Even a pretty mature high school senior in the scheme of what we're working towards is a developing athlete. I train Tom Schreiber, who is recognized as the top lacrosse player in the world. He's the captain of the United States lacrosse team. He won the MVP of the PLL, and he's in his early 30s. He's to me, we're working on stuff for him now for this year's field season that I would do if I had my 17-year-old accomplished lacrosse player. It's all of those little fundamental things that people gloss over that they miss because they're looking at the box jump and all this other stuff, when at the end of the day, that's not what's important. It's mechanics, it's how you run and how you translate that to your skill. What we do a lot, what I do with Tom is we go out, he works on his moves. I'm not a lacrosse coach. I know what he wants to accomplish, and I'm watching his feet and how he navigates. And what we're trying to do is make that more efficient. That's what I do with everybody. And if I had someone come in that's a pickleball player, that's a recreational athlete, it's the same thing. It's the same progression. It's how we get you here. One person might take more steps and the other one might get through those steps quicker, but we're still going to go through those steps.
That's good. I like that. And I like that perspective because again, back to the specialization, everybody's trying to, special, like I'm just doing this sport, etc. And so I like that perspective of like, no, like you need to learn how to move. Um,
Right.
so what about when we take it up to the high school level? A lot of my athletes tend to be more the high school level. And so for them, how does that training differ? What do you add in? What do you maybe subtract or yeah.
Well, some of the progression, I might go quicker through it, depending on where they're at. There used to be this prescription for plyometrics that you only should do a certain amount. My sense is, if a kid's playing basketball, and he's jumping and running and he's doing that multiple times a week, you have to be aware of that. But at the same time, we can't treat them like we're wrapping them in bubble wrap. They can do a lot of that work. If it's not being done in conjunction with stuff that's working at odds to that. So if you're jumping them, but you're also heavy deadlifting and heavy squatting them or goblet squatting them or whatever, then you should need to step back because you're working at odds. So that's where I make the difference. My programs change in the volume of work we get done, the complex varieties I can add to the basic movements, and take them all on a case by case basis. I always compare it to the best golfers in the world still go to a swing coach, and they're not necessarily changing things of a big picture nature. They're changing it very small details that matter in a game of inches or a game of seconds. All of those things matter. So that's what I'm looking at. How efficient can we make our athletes, and how can we not overload them, which is the other thing. There's no more off season. That's more of a concern, Nick. The bigger problem is that there's no more off season, and these kids, you have to be aware of multiple things they're doing in the youth level. But in New Jersey, believe it or not, Nick, our hockey athletes who are playing in the high school season can also be playing club. For some reason, that's the only sport that permits that. Lacrosse, basketball, you cannot. Baseball, you cannot be playing club at the same time you're playing a high school sport. So although some of these guys still do training for it, it can't be organized. So you have to still be always aware of that. And if a kid's in the off season, then they can. And like if I have a kid that's coming to me for lacrosse, he could be playing basketball in the winter and doing lacrosse training in the winter and coming to me. So that's where that becomes more of a difficult situation than worrying about what we're working on, even because the progressions take care where I'm at. The progressions take care of themselves. It's kind of like it's a natural progression for me once I get them in the mix. I break things down into the explosiveness, coordination, their body weight, and their traditional strength. And I do use some traditional strength, but it's in the context of not how heavy we could go and not how many sets we could do and grinding things out.
I like that. And I like again, there is that level of personalization, especially, I mean, even if you look at emotional, mental maturity in a lot of them, where, same with me with nutrition, it's like some of my athletes can handle a lot more, of that fine tuning that you talk about with their
Right.
nutrition compared to others where it's like, we just gotta get you eating consistently. Like,
Right.
so it's the same thing. Like you gotta, it's like the walking or crawling before you walk and walking before you run. And yeah.
Yep. And the eating, we didn't even touch upon that. That's another disaster
Yes.
that we have to overcome, which is responsible for a lot of the problems we see.
Yeah, I mean that's why I chose to work specifically at as a for student athletes, for more of the younger populations. Because yes, we have them at the college and the pro levels, but there's this big gap, and it's like this is where they build their habits, just like in training. This is where they build all of those bad habits.
Yeah.
Yeah. We could probably hit on like a whole podcast just on that piece for sure together.
Yeah, like I said, I could go for a long time. So just you
Hmm.
point me in the right direction, and we're good to go.
Yeah. No, we'll definitely have you back. Definitely unpack some more things. But I want to make sure our listeners know where to find you, where to follow you and whatnot. I'll put it in the show notes, but what are the
Yep.
best ways to reach you?
So I'm doing the podcast on the Real Voices of the Game Network with Dave D'Agostino. It's called The Hot Corner with Coach Sal. It started out as just baseball, but we've kind of veered off. So that's one place. I'm on Twitter at Sal Marinello, all spelled together. But I just started a new social media channel. It's called The Thinking Body Revival with Coach Sal. And what I'm doing there, Nick, is I'm taking, if you see off to the, I guess to my right, your left, I have a bookcase. I have some old school books there, and there's such good knowledge in those books that have been forgotten. The purpose of my channel is to talk about how much we knew back then that we've forgotten and we're not using that we should, incorporating it with the new, with the old, and also talk about something important. And I'm not talking about Republican versus Democrat, but how the political spectrum has taken over what I call our health and wellness freedoms. And you have to be aware. I'm not saying there are positions of one party or the other. I'm just saying we're at a point in our lives where that's necessary to know how you take care of yourself, what and how you can eat. So we kind of, I'm incorporating that all together. And that, again, I'm on YouTube and Rumble. And if you go Coach Sal M on either of those platforms, you can find it. But the channel is called The Thinking Body Revival. And one quick thing I'll tell you, the reason of that is the best book. I'm going to like to give people book recommendations. The book is called The Thinking Body. It was written in the 90s by a woman named Mabel Ellsworth Todd. That was a class at NYU that she put into a book form. There's more good stuff in that book than you could find in a month's worth of social media scrolling. So I recommend that book. It's on Amazon. You could get it for like 20 bucks. I've read it many times and have taken notes on it, and I refer to it regularly. So that's my tip of the day.
I love that. And I think a really good theme of this for listeners is just because something's new doesn't mean it's good. I feel like I think a lot of us forget that. I mean, politically, again, more performance wise, definitely. And so really recognizing, okay, like something might be good if it's new, but we need to deconstruct it a little bit and make sure, is it actually beneficial, or is it more harmful than good? So
Yeah, well, there's a phrase I kind of came up with. It's called timeline superiority, which because we occupy this point in the timeline, we think we're better than anything that's come before us, which is clearly not true, or else we wouldn't have had empires fall. And I can give you one quick example. We still can't build the pyramids the way the pyramids were built way back 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. So right there, that tells you that just because we're here doesn't mean we're better than what's come before us. There's good stuff, but like you said, we need to be able to critically think about them and decide what we're using and what we're not using.
that's good. And that's a good way. Yeah, that's a good way to wrap up for sure. Yeah, I'm not even going to add to that. I just want to say, Sal, thank you so much for hopping on. Like I said, we're definitely going to have you back.
My pleasure. Thanks, Nick. Great to be here.
Of course. And then for listeners, as always, keep striving for greatness.